welcome to another episode of our podcast, EPG Talks. Today, I'm joined by Nick Evans, who is fellow at the Ecologic Institute, which is an independent and academic think tank for environmental research and policy. Hi, Nick. Glad to have you on the podcast. Very happy you accepted the invitation.
Hi, Anna, thank you so much for having me. I'm very glad to be here.
Nice. Today, we're talking about many things, and we're trying to first of all, we will try to unpack the latest study of Ecologic Institute, Raising the Bar on National Governance in the EU. Afterwards, we will try to talk a little bit about the new European Commission and the new stances taken on climate in the new Commission mandate. Anyway, Nick, can you tell us more about the study, about some main findings, strengths and weaknesses from the governance to this governance systems that you analyzed at the Ecologic?
Yeah, of course. So the purpose of this study was really twofold. The first thing that we wanted to do was to investigate the tools and institutions and procedures that are used by national governments in the EU for climate policy making. And as a second step, on top of that, on the basis of where we found weaknesses and where there were gaps that we found, we tried to identify ways in which EU policy, so at the next level up, could serve to raise the standard overall at national level. So essentially improve practices at national level. And so importantly, our focus here in terms of what we were investigating is the national level, but we're looking for solutions in EU policy. And I think this gets really at the important dynamic of climate policy in the European Union is that you have this national and EU dynamic where the EU has put in place requirements for member states in terms of what they're supposed to do on climate. So not just substantively, but also when it comes to the kind of procedural aspects, the governance aspects of climate policy making. And so this is things like plans, climate planning, climate reporting, progress monitoring. The EU has requirements in place for member states, but at the same time, many member states go beyond what the EU does, and there's also differences in the implementation of said requirements at member state level. And so maybe worth noting that these kind of governance requirements on member states is in the grand scheme of things relatively new. This comes from the governance regulation that was adopted in 2018 at EU level, or at least many of the things we'll be talking about are found in the governance regulation. And that before that there was a long history of kind of reporting of what was happening in terms of greenhouse gas emissions at national level, and this comes also back to the kind of all the way back to under Kyoto and all the way back, UN reporting and the requirements that exist even above EU level. So I think that maybe just it's an important point to make that this notion of EU requiring member states to do more on governance and managing their policy making is not necessarily, it's relatively new, so to speak, in terms of the grand scheme of things for climate policy in Europe. But when it comes to, so in terms of how we went about looking at this, we thought, okay, well, a strong governance framework is providing kind of qualities for policymakers and policy in general, and also for stakeholders and private actors. And one, the first is being certainty. So this is over the speed and direction of the transition. So this could be things like long-term targets, strategic plans that are aimed at 2050, and also, of course, processes for revising these as the need arises. The second kind of value that we considered as that governance delivers, strong framework delivers, is accountability. So this could be things like progress monitoring, using indicators to check in detail where policies may be failing, and also ensuring expert input into policy making. We'll talk about that later. The third value is consistency, and this is a crucial one. So this is also meaning consistency or coherence over time, so between plans in the short term and then also long-term ambition, but also tools like green budgeting to ensure that public spending is aligned with net zero, and then of course consistency across, so horizontally across economic sectors, and so therefore also government ministries or the competent government ministries, because climate policy, the solutions, well, the crisis and the solutions kind of reach across all areas and sectors of society and economy. So it's important to have a very encompassing approach, an all of government approach. And then the final point here, and to that point, is the final value here we looked at was consensus. And so this really is permanent structures for engaging stakeholders and the public, private actors to foster buy-in into those policies, into those measures that are supposed to deliver climate neutrality, supposed to deliver on member states' climate targets. So at the end of the day, across these four qualities, we looked at actually 22 different practices, if you will, at national level. And we were just simply looking, are they being used? Are these things, is there a long-term climate plan that has that is essentially adequate and detailed enough? Is there an expert advisory council with a dedicated input to climate policy making? So these are the kind of practices we were looking for. Um, and in terms of the main findings, we found, you know, very briefly, in short, that it's quite a diverse landscape. And this more or less replicates some other work that we've done, but also other studies and surveys in the same field. That where there is this kind of baseline standard, if you will, that is required by the EU through the governance regulation since 2018, that, like I mentioned, many countries go above and beyond it. And this was one of the kind of points we made in the study, was to look more or less beyond what is required at EU level, because ostensibly that's member states should be doing that. And of course, when it comes to manner of implementation and how well it's being implemented, it's a different question. But we were looking for these practices were things that go beyond what the EU is really requiring. Um, and so in terms of our main findings, we find the first kind of main point, kind of key message I think I would want to highlight here, is that there's evidence of a two-track EU when it comes to the development of institutions and procedures. So it's not, perfect, I don't want to paint too black and white a picture here, but generally speaking, Central and Western European member states, as well as the Scandinavian countries in the north, tend to exhibit more of the 22 governance features that we looked at, compared to others. And this
So
suggests that
they have
regardless,
more comprehensive response to climate change, basically, through
yes,
their governance system. It's more put together.
yeah, if you think of these features as delivering on these qualities, accountability, certainty, consistency, and consensus, they're doing a better job at delivering those, at least in terms of the features that we looked at, right? And important to say here, I mean, these 22 features that we looked at it's not the exhaustive toolbox of climate policy or climate governance tools that governments have at their disposal, national governments have at their disposal, but it is informed by more or less what we know is out there, and also informed by what the EU suggests member states should be doing. So if you think about, they have kind of this baseline standard, and then the next step, if you will, is what we're looking at. Um, so in general, this two-track EU suggests that regardless of the baseline standards, which more or less everyone has across the border is required to fulfill, member states are operating on at least two tracks of development, so two speeds of development, if you will.
Yeah.
And that there is some regional clarity on that. Yeah. So how did you?
Yeah, so you would say that the Eastern European countries kind of exhibit less of the features and are not that well put together. Maybe also there's some inconsistencies between uh, their general response to climate mitigation and adaptation.
Yeah, maybe it's helpful to zoom in on one example here. So under the quality of accountability and how governance systems are delivering accountability, we looked at progress monitoring, so national progress monitoring, and whether a system is in place for national progress monitoring, checking if you're on track towards climate neutrality or towards your climate goals, because not all member states have necessarily a climate neutrality goal, although many do and most do. And in this particular example, I mean, generally speaking, overall, this is one of these gaps. There is progress monitoring required by the EU in a biennial fashion, based on the National Energy and Climate Plans. This is required under the governance regulation. But what we're looking at here is actually something that goes beyond this. Like I said, so we're looking at something that's really in an integrated process at national level with potentially national media coverage, where annually or periodically in some form, there's a regular progress check on how the country is doing on its own national climate goals. These could also be one and the same as its reported climate goals under the EU, under EU law. But still, it's a progress check that's not just reporting to the EU. And in this particular example, we find that this one is more pronounced in the Western Central European countries. So that be France and Germany has this, Denmark has this, but in Poland and Romania and others, this kind of national monitoring it does not exist. At least what we found. Now, it's important to note that one caveat of a study like this is that things can happen behind the scenes that you may
Yeah,
not be savvy to, and
yeah,
uh,
that's true. That's true.
yeah, and so it's always a bit difficult to know, especially on some of these more technical questions, whether something really is occurring. But at the end of the day, on this particular example, I think is a good one because if it's not, for instance, this monitoring is not part of a clear framework and it's happening more in an ad hoc form, or is happening more as a technical exercise that doesn't see the light of day, then
Yeah,
it's
or
yeah.
maybe it doesn't happen at all, right? It's
Or,
just on paper. It's
or
just on paper and that's it.
Sure, sure. Or happens, but it's not really worth its weight in anything. And yeah, valid point. All those things just undermine the whole point of the progress monitor in the first place, which is to, shed light and
Yeah,
deliver
yeah, yeah,
accountability, shed
yeah.
light on where things are failing, and deliver accountability for the accountability from the national government. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, anyway, it's congratulations again for the study because it's I see a lot of work put into it, and it's always a pleasure to skim through it whenever I have some questions. Now, in the report, you have a very comprehensive list of recommendations. Um, there's definitely a lot to unpack also there, but maybe you could choose a few that you find the most important to talk about.
Sure. Yeah. So for each one of the kind of main gaps that we found, we tried to think of ways or identify ways that in which the EU, like I said, could could develop new policy or amend existing policy, or it may not even be necessarily in the form of regulation. It could also be in the form of new guidelines or resources and funding and support for member states. So there's a wide range of different ways in which these or different forms these recommendations take. But I think ones that I think are maybe very important when it comes to the certainty question. So, like I said, many countries, actually, the vast majority of countries have a climate neutrality target set in some form, which is good news because the EU has a climate neutrality target set, and we need that ideally all EU member states have one, so that it actually adds up to EU climate neutrality. And so we're well on the way there, but what's missing is clarity in many cases of what climate neutrality. You think of climate neutrality as an equation. What's missing is often how are our member states accounting for their residual emissions? It's and I think you've frozen. I want to make sure that we're
Yeah,
not
are you
stopped.
frozen?
So what we find is that there's oftentimes lack of clarity on the climate neutrality target. And what I mean by this is that if you think of climate neutrality as a net target, right, it's really an equation. The residual part of the equation, how you're getting to that net zero, is not always clear. So oftentimes member states are throwing a climate neutrality target down the road, sometime 2045, most of the time 2050, but not clarifying what they mean, what they mean by that. And in no cases does this mean that we plan to get rid of all emissions. So in many cases, or in all cases, we assume there are residual emissions, but it's not always clear how those are accounted for. And those could be accounted for through natural sinks. And there is EU legislation in the short term require that actually has national targets for natural sinks, but it only goes through 2030, and all the climate neutrality targets are further down in the future. Or it could be through technical means. And I mean, one of the elements here is that there's quite a bit of uncertainty around technical carbon dioxide removal and the kind of um, technological maturity of these things, and there is limited pilot projecting and so forth. So a lot of the focus has been on the natural side. Um, but I think it's one of the ways in which, so one of our recommendations that the EU could actually require that there be targets for long-term carbon dioxide removals. These could be either nationally determined, so that you could say there has to be a target, decide on it at a national level, or it could be prescribed kind of in a similar manner as the effort sharing regulation, where it actually is decided at EU level and then split out among the member states. And this would at least ensure consistency, that the carbon dioxide removal targets, the CDR targets, actually add up to the amount of residual emissions removals that is needed at EU level. So this is one of the things that, I mean, it's one of those things that requires a lot more exploration how this would actually look. But given the unclarity that's there, despite the good positive development that many member states have climate neutrality targets now, an EU solution, I think is needed. One of the things that we looked at, and one of the key policy innovations that has spread across the EU, as you know, and it's also I think a really important discussion now in the Romanian case, is the scientific advice for policymaking, and many countries have some form of independent council or independent commission, different names, but effectively these are composed of all the same, composed of academics, non-governmental officials who advise on policymaking, and in some cases even engage in conduct regular assessments and monitoring of governmental policy in the sense of in the form of like a watchdog or in the form of an oversight role function. Um, and our recommendation here is that, I mean, obviously the EU has this at EU level since the adoption of the EU climate law. The European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change fulfills this role at EU level, and it also in its work programs has indicated a willingness and readiness to engage with its national counterparts, so these national advisory bodies. And this is very, very good. And this is one way in which the EU can potentially influence or motivate national governments to establish these institutions. It's also suggested in the EU climate law. It's not, the wording isn't very strong. They're invited, member states are invited to establish these bodies. But one of the ways in which what we recommend is that it's one thing that can be difficult is that that the ownership is a very important part of this. If the EU mandates the establishment of scientific advisory bodies at national level, it might actually undermine their legitimacy in a national context. And what these evidence-based bodies should be providing is a legitimacy and objectivity in the national context to national policy. And of course, I mean, they can meet at EU level, and there can be convening by the European Scientific Advisory Board, bringing these scientists together to talk about things and the national EU dynamic. But if they're not seen as legitimate in a national context, that undermines their purpose. And so even though the European Advisory Board has suggested they be made mandatory at EU level, we took a step back and suggested that there might be other ways to get at the same thing, get at least this function of evidence and injecting evidence into policymaking, climate policymaking, without actually prescribing an institution creation. And yeah.
Yeah. Actually, this was the next question, because in the report you have kind of like the hard EU fix and then the soft EU fix on the matter, and it's you explained very well that there's this clash between, and this, I wouldn't say a clash, I would say rather a tension between national ownership and EU policy.
Mhm.
And then I'm interested how, because it seems like some governance features can be top down
Yeah.
and they can be implemented effectively in a country.
Mm.
Such were the ones prescribed by the governance regulation. And then there's the ones that really need to stand out from the national context. And honestly, in how do you, and now we're kind of jumping to the next topic of discussion, which is a future revision of the governance regulation and of the EU climate law. I
Hmm.
think more of interest is the revision of the governance regulation, because basically you can input more governance features into the regulation rather than the EU climate law,
Hmm.
which is more EU wide.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, how do you see this revision? Like, and also given the political context now, the new Commission, the new European Parliament, which is a little bit more conservative, even though the EPPs are still in power, it's a little bit more conservative, more right-wing leaning. Do you see that there's going to be more of a strong revision of the regulation, or rather mild, something that will not really upset member states, given also the kind of frail political context that many member states are facing right now? I mean, there's not only the Romanian case that the far right is searching, but we already have far right governments in the EU. Slovakia is definitely not doing great. Then France as well is kind of far right, is looming always in the background
Mm.
of their government.
Mm. Mm. Germany.
So, how do you see this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think it's honestly really hard to tell at this point. You have, like you said, all of these kind of developments at national level, and you're also right to say that there are clearly new political priorities, and these things somewhat have, at least these have somewhat shifted at the EU level. I think Teresa Ribeiro's upcoming role as executive vice president of a clean, just, and competitive transition is somewhat indicative here, right? This is a title change.
Exactly. And also in the political guidelines, competitiveness seems to kind of has the upper hand in all of the EU policies that are gonna come during the next 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's important. Only I fully agree. That there's this new kind of weight added to the competitiveness, resilience, security kind of side of things. I do think it's important to remember, however, that at the center of the European Green Deal is this notion of a socially and economically prosperous future, that a socially and economically prosperous future and a climate neutral future are not mutually exclusive, right? So this was, and I think that I like to think of the new commission's lean towards competitiveness, resilience, security, just and fair transition is still in there. It's less a departure, but more a reframing of more or less the same underlying core ideas in terms that are maybe perhaps more politically tenable given the makeup of the parliament, like you mentioned, and also not to mention recent geopolitical developments, right? So my thinking is that this renewed, and also it's maybe important also to note that this renewed focus on EU industrial policy, for instance, was very much a part of the last commission, right? So it's accelerated by the protectionist provisions in the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act,
Yeah.
but this is 2 years ago. So I think, in short, in my mind, maybe I'm overly optimistic here, but the European Green Deal is still very much the underlying paradigm. And you brought up von der Leyen's political guidelines. It's in there, and it's part of her legacy. So I think she would be hard pressed to really dismantle some of the kind of key components of it. I also think in considering who's pushing forward any revisions on the side of the commission. So who's really is holding the pen when it comes to the governance regulation. Um,
Mhm.
the people that von der Leyen has put in place here are also, I think, a bit of cause for some cautious optimism, at least at EU level. I mean, first you have Ribera at the helm. in my opinion, is a strong signal. At national level, during her time at the ministry in Spain, she was really a force behind the adoption of the Spanish climate law.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so,
That's true.
she's
That's true.
she's no stranger to a strong having what the importance of a strong framework and the importance of a strong governance framework, at least at national level, and so would understand and bring that spirit to her position at the EU. I would think. Secondly, with Dan Jorgensen, Commissioner for Energy, this is an interesting choice, I think, because similarly to Ribera, he, as his position as Ministry for Climate, I think now is
Climate
the
utilities and energy in he was in Denmark. Yeah.
exactly in Denmark. Yeah, on his watch, he oversaw one of the stronger legal frameworks for climate policy making in the EU. The Danish climate law is a strong, and it was revised in his under his tenure, so and made stronger. The final is Hoekstra as a holdover. So Wopke Hoekstra is, of course, the incumbent commissioner for climate, and there were certainly grumblings at his initial by civil society and advocacy groups at his initial appointment, but due to his ties with the fossil fuel industry or past ties. But he's a holdover from the last commission, and was very much working with von der Leyen on the European Green Deal
Yeah.
priorities. So
Yeah.
I all this is to say that I think that this is it's certainly a reframing. It's certainly a weighting of certain priorities that weren't there before. But my hope is that it doesn't actually undermine the strength of climate policy and climate governance. And one way in which this new framing is manifesting, and this was seen in the political guidelines, but across many of the mission letters to the new commissioners, was really it's a strong simplification and streamlining mandate. And you see this in that Hoekstra is tasked with proposing the new 2040 target, which we know, but also preparing a climate policy architecture beyond 2030, explicit call for him to organize dialogues with stakeholders on this. And then actually Jorgensen is working closely with the climate commissioner, of course, is tasked
Yeah.
specifically to streamline the governance of the energy union, and that's the governance regulation. So the role, the mandate to change the governance regulation falls to Dan Jorgensen, who's the incoming commissioner for energy and housing. And I think that's his previous post in Denmark, and also the strength of the Danish framework. If that's any indication, suggests to me that I don't think there's too much um, um, risk of him really dismantling the governance regulation. But the question is the question is a little bit, how does this streamlining and simplification mandate manifest when it comes to changes to the governance regulation? I think that's what's going to be.
Yeah. I also think it's definitely not going to be weaker, but maybe I'm a little bit more skeptical around how strong the and how mandatory. I mean, not mandatory. I don't think it's the right word to use here, but rather how. Yeah, how far is he gonna go with this?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to know. And
Yeah, because I mean, yeah, he's great. But his previous experience showcased him as a great commissioner indeed. And yeah, Denmark is one of the leading countries in the EU on climate. One of the most ambitious targets. They're putting a lot of money into it. I think it's also their climate council is like the strongest one in Europe. They have the most exhaustive funding for their climate council, so they're definitely a good practice. But how how is he gonna how will he manage to bring all of his past experience and good practices into this revision, given the overall context of the political context of the European member states? definitely this is not an answer. This is not a question that we will answer now and today, but it's rather also for our listeners to kind of think of when they put their heads on the pillows tonight.
I think, I mean,
Yeah,
if you took one of the things, so the commission has republished its review of the governance regulation, and if you look at that report, two things that they've picked up on, among many things, but that certainly caught my eye, when it comes to needed revisions or problems with the governance regulation. And they are not suggesting what they're going to do here. This is really just looking at the functioning of so it's a report on the functioning of the governance
exactly,
regulation. Yeah,
exactly. But
that's an
at the same
important.
time, they're hinting. I feel like they kind of preparing the ground for. So when the revision comes, nobody's gonna be like, "Oh, what is this? Where does
Yeah,
this come from?"
yeah, and the governance regulation, like the EU climate law, is on a 5-year review cycle. So this is all built into the system, and good, and importantly so. Of course, if it leads to a weakening of the system, that's a problem from a climate policy, climate governance perspective. But at the same time, when you look at that report, two things that caught my eye. One is that the Commission is clearly acknowledging the fact that there's a need to solve inconsistencies between the long and short-term planning. So there has been no,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah. And honestly, now I really have an example from Romania. The long term strategy is already outdated for us. I mean, it was already published late, and now it's already outdated because the new NECP sets a much ambitious target for 2030. In the past, it was 78% emission reductions by 2030. Now it's 87.
mhm.
And already all the projections from the LTS are no longer operational, let's say.
Yeah, yeah, and that's that,
But
and
at the same
Romania is not.
time, it's the document that's gonna guide the country till 2050. So there's a little bit of a paradox here.
And Romania is not alone there. I mean, the German LTS is also out of date. The Czech LTS, I think, is currently being revised, is out of date, more older than 5 years old. And so,
And it's funny because the governance regulation actually stipulates when member states deem it necessary, right? But even
mhm.
though there's all of these documents that everybody knows they're already outdated, nothing happens.
Yeah. Well, it's a question. It's like what is the bar that has to be met for member states to deem something necessary,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. But well, we're not legal experts, so I'm not sure we can answer
Yeah.
this question.
Certainly not. And yeah, it's a hard one. But that's one thing they picked up on, and I think it's an important one. And I think it's one where the streamlining and simplification agenda here, this kind of better in the context of the of the EU's better regulation agenda, could actually do some good. Right? There is a world in which some streamlining, some leveraging of synergies that exist could help to integrate long and short-term planning in a way that actually enhances the consistency between these. And this gets at the second thing that the report picked up on, and it's interesting because of the Danish case. So because of Jørgensen's appointment, um, they're picking up on the fact that member states, some have their own national cycles that don't align necessarily with the governance regulation cycle.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
this this may be planning, but it could also be national reporting. It could be a many things. And there's a need to allow somehow or facilitate an alignment between national cycles and EU cycles so that member states aren't doing essentially the work twice or can see the EU cycles as valuable, right? If you can align them better, then you can actually do the same, you can use the same exercise for both. And the Danish case is an interesting case here because we did an assessment of long-term strategies, and you just talked about how strong Denmark is on climate policy, and I fully agree with you. But their long-term strategy, compared, at least the one that they submitted to the EU, is quite low in detail compared to other countries. It's not among one of the better ones. And you begs the question, what's going on here? And the answer seems to be that Denmark has its own long-term planning cycle, its own national cycle. It doesn't see the EU one, at least from a national perspective, as that important. It
Mhm.
sees it as a box checking exercise. And I don't want to
Okay.
speak for the ministry here, but essentially
Yeah,
what
yeah,
we have
yeah.
happening is they're doing it twice. Yeah. And they're going to focus on their national plan and not necessarily on the EU
Yeah, yeah, and
submission.
I also think this also comes from the fact that there's no requirements, formal requirements for what the LTS should contain as a document. So there's a
Yeah.
whole heterogeneous, how do you pronounce it in English? Like,
Heterogeneity. Yeah.
yeah, heterogeneity of LTSs out there
Yeah.
that are very hard to compare one with the other, if you ask me.
Yeah, and it doesn't lend itself to any kind of real comprehensive assessment of these, certainly in a regular form, and much less an assessment of their consistency with the NECPs. So
Yeah, yeah.
any assessment of consistency that we've done has been based on kind of proxy, considering when and how they were prepared, is the kind of methodologically consistency there, but really a comprehensive check of their consistency has not yet been done by the EU, and it's not required of the EU, even though the consistency is required. Um, the assessment is not, and so but it's very important and very necessary, and I think it's a good sign that the EU is picking up on this. It's a question of how they'll actually implement it when it comes to the revisions.
Just a few concluding remarks from your side.
The So maybe just picking back up on this, I think that the real question for anyone working in our space, in the climate governance space, is what is this simplification, this um, streamlining agenda going to look like when it comes to the really important work that the EU has already done on climate governance? It should be said over and over and over again that the governance regulation is the reason that we see many of these practices even being taken up at national level. I've heard that anecdotally from my interviews with public officials and ministry officials at national level, that the governance regulation was essentially what they needed to get the ball rolling on some key national governance practices. And so it's going to, we all know that it's important. We all know how important it is, and we don't want to see a weakening of these structures and a weakening of this at EU level. And so it is we're watching this very closely. What does the streamlining, what does the simplification look like? And that being said, I think that any conservative political party acting in good faith will be receptive to this simplification streamlined agenda, and actually it could be used as a way to as an argument for good climate governance, for good
Yeah,
management,
yeah,
good
yeah,
policy management.
yeah. And just to add an idea here, I think the way the new commission reshaped its narrative around climate, there's definitely gonna be a uh, rephrase of argumentation, so even the most contentious features in a future revision can actually pass.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I I um I I think it's important to remember that because climate neutrality, the transition to climate neutrality is so complicated and requires so many policymakers and so many different sectors to be working together,
Yeah,
that an economic approach is not necessarily a bad approach. One that does kind of prioritize competitiveness and does prioritize the industrial transition and just transition is an approach that I think can bring some voices on board, maybe, and bring some sectors and actors on board that may not have been there before.
yeah. Okay. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. It was a real pleasure, and I think you've done great uh,
Good.
as a
Thank you very
guest.
much, Anna.
Yeah,
Thank you for
definitely
having
looking
me.
forward to our next podcast.
Always happy to take part. You've helped saved us many times over to get a sense, get clarity on the case in Romania and also at EU level. And so yeah, much
Sure.
appreciated.
Okay.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Bye.